It was the first time that the courts had really done something like this, you know, in anyone's recollection. All through our campaign, been very interested in doing two things at the same time. One is changing the law, and two, educating the public to the fact that this kind of work was being done, educating the public to the notion that as a private citizen, as a single individual, if you see something that is wrong, if you see government doing something wrong, if you see wherever it is you work doing something wrong, you can start yourself to try to change it. And this is a very important concept because increasingly we see in society, everybody looks around, everybody sees all kinds of things that are bad, and they figure it's somebody else's job to change it, not mine. I mean, you know, people they'll listen to the news on the radio or the television and say, why doesn't somebody do something about it? One of the most significant things for me was to get it into the mind of the public through media that whenever you ask the question, why doesn't somebody do something about this? The answer to that question is looking back at you in the mirror, to get people to believe in their own abilities to change and control their own lives. And so we had spent a lot of time and a lot of energy doing everything we could to get press on this. And of course, the media campaign had gone just about the same way that the law campaign. We just couldn't get anybody to do any kind of media at the beginning. We couldn't get any kind of legal assistance at the beginning. And once we got to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, it was the first legal victory, and then it just blew up the media thing, where nobody was writing anything on this before all of a sudden everybody was writing, you know, anything they could get their hands on. And that was a major, major change point in this campaign. What followed from there is because we had won in the Ninth Circuit, the cops then appealed it. And they appealed it the only place that you can appeal it to, which is the United States Supreme Court. And nobody expected this thing to go to the Supreme Court. And so we pretty much figured it was, you know, over with. But to everybody's amazement, it was accepted by the United States Supreme Court. And this put into motion a major convergence of just about everybody who was anybody in the progressive, liberal, or civil rights community. One of the things that was very dramatic about this case was that it probably got more publicity, and it probably had more people participating as amicus curiae than perhaps any other case that was heard by the court that year. And that is a direct quote from whoever the Supreme Court reporter was for, I believe, CBS News. It was a curious undertaking because the way that things work in the United States Supreme Court is it's in Washington, D.C. That's the only place it is. Everything that happens, you have to go to them. What they do is they have a period where you send them all kinds of briefs, all kinds of paper arguments. And then after they get the briefs, they have a period where they do oral arguments where, you know, presumably you go there and you just basically say, you know, this is what I think is true, and they listen to you, and then they ask you questions, and then months later they give you a decision. The most dramatic day in the Supreme Court is oral arguments. We've done a bunch of work the weeks before oral arguments to get all of the press that we could interested, because again, at every intersection in this project, my interest was in the education of the public, in changing the public's mind, in infusing these kind of ideas into the public discourse and therefore public policy. I was always as interested in that as much as in changing the law. And so, like, we're working feverishly to get all the press interest we could get, to get all of the media interest we could get, and to do little maintenance things like we had to actually physically figure out how to get to Washington, D.C. in oral arguments. We, of course, spent every dime we had on all of the press and all of the press packages and so forth. And it's a very good example of how if you start a great campaign, then stuff just happens when you need it. Miraculously, we're sitting there trying to figure out how to get to Washington, D.C. We get a phone call. It's ABC News. And the show is, I think, Good Morning America. And they wanted to know if we would be willing to do an interview with them on this, which is like a big deal. And we said, okay, fine. So automatically, plane ticket to Washington, D.C. So that was solved. The day of the oral arguments come, and I go downstairs in the elevator of the Mayfair Hotel. I needed a cab, so they got me a cab. I don't know what he thought I was doing, but he decided since I told him I was going to the Supreme Court, that I obviously was part of the janitorial staff. And so the man delivers me to the Supreme Court, but to the servants' entrance. Now, this is, of course, a little piece of American history I didn't know. I did not know that there was a servants' entrance in the Supreme Court. I should have figured that out, because people certainly are not going to clean up behind themselves. So, I should have figured that out. But I didn't know that prior to this. And so I get out of the cab. I started walking around the Supreme Court building, and you've seen pictures of the Supreme Court building. The front of it is this massive set of stairs that probably go up 2 or 3 stories, just stairs that just go up into the heavens. Hopefully up to justice, although that's not always the case. And so I walk around in the front of the building, and I see the staircase. And about halfway up the staircase on the other side, I see like this huge mass of sort of like reporters have basically glommed into this great reporting mass with microphone booms sticking out and people with notepads and cameras everywhere. And I said to myself, well, I wonder if, who's being interviewed in the middle of all of this media stuff. And as I'm asking, I barely got the words out of my mind's mouth. Interesting concept. And I hear somebody in the crowd scream, "There he is!" And it turns out that all of the work that we had done, sending out all the press releases to develop all that media interest, there it all was. And they just, like a white sale at Macy's, they started stampeding, running towards me. Everyone that you could think of, NBC, CBS, NBC, everybody. There, and they're covering the case. And it was a major, major story. It affected a lot of people. We did oral arguments. And then, I think about maybe 4 months later, I'm in Berkeley, California, a stone's throw from UC Berkeley, which is where I'd done a lot of the law research, a place called Bolt Hall, which is the law school on the campus of the University of Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley. Phone rings, and it was CBS News, and it woke me up, of course, and they asked me if I wanted to make a statement about the report this morning, and they were the first to inform me that the United States Supreme Court had just announced their decision in Callender versus Lawson, that we had won, that the courts had declared the practice of arbitrarily stopping Americans for no purpose than requesting identification when one is a pedestrian, when one is at liberty, when one is in public, it had been overturned. It had been ruled unconstitutional. And as such, that particular era in the long history of racial inequity had been brought to an end.